Hello, strangers. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if you're new here, welcome for the first time. Every Tuesday, I bring you a story that hasn't been told anywhere else. And today's story is story number 303. I grew up in a religious community. Not like the Amish or anything, but everybody I knew, everybody I went to school with, and all of my parents' friends all seemed to go to one of the same loose collection of churches in the area. And one of the common things you could expect in those churches was lock-ins, especially in the summer. For those who didn't grow up in that kind of culture, the concept of a lock-in is bog simple. A youth group will convene at the church and usually set up sleeping rules, blankets, sometimes even whole tents or forts, right in the middle of the main auditorium. They might show a movie on the big screen where they usually show lyrics to the worship songs. Generally, they'll have a couple of extra youth pastors or volunteer adults to make sure that all the girls stay on one side and all the boys stay on the other, and everyone gets locked in. And the lock-in part is that no one is supposed to leave. Not for the whole night, until your parents pick you up the following morning. It seemed like the churches alternated. Each weekend, each youth pastor would hold a lock-in. I distinctly remember it was my friend Sarah's church's turn, because she had the youth pastor who looked almost exactly like Lance Bass. This particular lock-in was in late August, potentially the last one we'd have of the summer, and also meaning that said youth pastor and his volunteers were probably pretty tired of us. Security, thus, had become more and more lax, so it was pretty easy to slip out. At this lock-in was the already mentioned Sarah, myself, and two others, Kate and Rue. We were all 16, and I happened to be nursing the world's biggest and most embarrassing crush on a boy named Colt. I'm talking a stupid crush, the kind of crush where you romanticize everything about a person, right down to the way he held his phone. He held his hand upright like a blade and rested the phone on his palm. For some reason, that captivated me. In hindsight, that reason was definitely hormones. It was at that lock-in that Sarah told me she and Kate had uncovered a big secret. So we sat through the almost obligatory message and waited until they put on a movie. It must have been one of the Left Behinds, before we all excused ourselves to go to the bathroom, our giggles echoing down the empty hallway. As many lock-ins as I've attended, it's always a little strange to see a church that you're used to seeing in the full Sunday morning light cast in nothing but shadow, save the occasional flashlight glare of an opening door. In the bathroom, Kate and Sarah told me that they'd uncovered that Colt reciprocated my feelings. Furthermore, he and his friends were hoping to meet us that very night. I couldn't quite believe it. In fact, rationally, I don't believe that I did. But the chance was so alluring that I let myself get swept away with it. Never once asking why a boy who quite literally had never spoken to me once in his entire life would suddenly be expressing such feelings of ardor to, say, how did Sarah and Kate know about it? Again, this was not a time for logic. This was a time for action. Sarah, Kate, Rue, and I all knew the business. We'd simply wait until lights out, and then one by one, we'd make our way to the bathroom once we were sure that the pastor and volunteers were either asleep themselves or preoccupied. We'd done it before, and this night was no exception. One by one, we slipped out the back entrance. The weather was turning the corner to fall, but it was still plenty hot and muggy out, and the fireflies blinked like out-of-season Christmas lights somebody had left up on their house long after Christmas was over. The whole way, my friends were gassing me up, and I was worrying about the sweat collecting on my upper lip and how badly damaged my makeup was getting. Priorities. We'd walked a few blocks. I kept asking Kate and Sarah where we were supposed to meet Colt and his friends. I was starting to get a little nervous. Sure, we'd slipped out before, but never for very long. And if one of the volunteers woke up and happened to notice we were gone, it'd be big trouble. But Sarah told me Colt would be waiting up ahead, by one of those historical buildings that the society in town refused to let be torn down. I stopped. I think the heat was making me a little cranky, plus the stress of suddenly being thrust into a potential dating situation, my first ever. I asked Sarah, Wait, I thought you said Colt was going to be there with friends. You just said Colt by himself. She and Kate shared a glance, and then they burst out laughing. It was a trick. In that moment, the heat, the stress, the anger at my friends for using something I was so vulnerable about, and those heightened teenage emotions telling me that this was indeed betrayal of the highest order by those who should have had my back the best, made me explode. I yelled at them and stormed off, not back to the church, but onward. I don't know where I was going. I wasn't thinking that far ahead, just that I needed to make my dramatic exit so that my true anger would be known. Rue, Kate, and Sarah trailed behind. As they followed, they tried to cajole me to come back to the church and said sorry, it was just a joke. But Kate and Sarah were still laughing, and when I glanced back, I saw Rue hiding a smile. That just made me angrier, and I took off at a run. It surprised them, and there was plenty of distance between us by the time I finally stopped, hands on knees, sucking air, in front of, sure enough, one of those historical society-protected, run-down houses. I guess it wasn't a house. It was a stark white building with a steeple. They looked like there were some words in black high up on the steeple, some kind of church maybe. I turned around. I couldn't see my friends anymore in the dark, but I could hear them coming. A thought occurred to me in that instant. They'd had their fun with me. Why not have my fun with them? See how they liked it. I ran up the couple of steps and tried the door, and as though God himself was on my side, egging me on to seek my sweet, sweet revenge, the door to the historical building was unlocked. I opened it, and I slipped inside. As dark as it had been outside, at least there was ambient light. Inside was dark as a closet. Very little light came from the few windows placed around the outer walls. It took my eyes a while to adjust, but I started to move into what appeared to be a single room. The entire building itself was indeed one room. As my eyes acclimated, I breathed in deeply, and then nearly had a coughing fit. Historical indeed. The air was dusty, stale, redolent of some sort of piney smell, probably from the wooden floors that creaked beneath my feet. Also, while the door had been left open, no air conditioning to speak of, it was stifling hot, like an oven. The few beads of sweat on my upper lip were soon joined by rivulets of sweat coming down from my temples. I could feel my cotton t-shirt sticking to my back. Good thing meeting Colt was a joke. I probably looked like I'd just crawled out of a swamp in this state. Still, as my eyes began to acclimate to the dark, I began to see shapes, vague shapes in front of me, a row of and then my eye caught movement at the far end of the single room. I'd been breathing deep
trying to catch my breath from my impromptu sprint to get to the building, and now I shook as I tried to hold it, tried to listen, tried to hear, but I heard nothing. It was muffled. The only sounds were my own heart and my own breath. I turned, looking for a light switch, but as I did, in the periphery of my eye, I caught movement again. I turned back, straining my eyes to see what it was. My night vision was coming in better and better, and I realized what was before me were not the orderly pews of a church as I'd guessed. They were desks, wooden desks, lined up in orderly little rows. My eyes scanned them, but I didn't sense any movement there. As I raised my eyes from those rows, following a path from them back to the far end of the room, I saw another desk, a much larger one, and behind it a black expanse that must have been a chalkboard. It was an old school, one of those Laura Ingalls Wilder Pioneer Day single-room schools, and aside from what might have been a couple of bookshelves or other blocky pieces of furniture, there was nothing else there. I had exactly 1 second of relief, just one, before out of the dead center of that black inky expanse of a chalkboard, a woman came into view. She had long dark hair and an equally dark dress, high-collared, and I realized that when I'd been scanning the room looking for her, she'd simply been camouflaged in with the chalkboard, and only now that she turned could I see her pale white face. I stood stock still, all at once feeling cold and hot at the same time. She'd come from nowhere, and while I could see her move, I couldn't feel her move. That tiny way that you can feel the wind when somebody disturbs the dust in the air. And there was plenty of dust in this air. But there was no sense of movement beyond simply watching her and my eyes tracking her twitching. And that was the word. She wasn't gliding, she wasn't smooth, she was twitching, in and out, flickering almost. I locked eyes with her, at least I think I did. She was still so far from me that her face was little more than a bowling ball's resemblance to a human face. 2 dark spots where the eyes should have been, and a prim, small mouth. Even her nose sort of blended into the whiteness of the rest of her face. I felt pinned by that dark gaze. I was waiting for them to say something, to call me out for wandering around in a building I definitely wasn't allowed to be in this late. But she didn't say anything to me at all, but instead, all I heard was my own heartbeat. Finally, I felt that dead bowling ball gaze leave mine as she lowered those eyes and started to scan the desks before me. In the same way that seeing somebody yawn makes you want to yawn, my eyes wanted to follow hers, and so I did. I remember feeling cautious relief. The woman had clearly seen me, but she hadn't said anything. But as I thought that, another thought popped up, like the eyes of an alligator rising above the waterline. Wait, if she's not remarking on the fact that I'm not supposed to be here, is she supposed to be here? And as I thought that, I looked at the orderly row of desks before me, gleaming, quiet, and empty. But they weren't empty. For I noticed now with a shock that half of their number, at least a dozen, weren't empty at all. The bodies of children were occupying those desks, all facing forward. Except, as my eyes came into the best night focus they would, I felt my gorge rise in my throat, threatening to choke me. They couldn't be said to be facing anything. Their bodies were there, only up to the neck. I didn't want to, but as though against their will, my eyes were dragged back up to that teacher in the front. and sure enough, she was looking back at me. My blood was rushing in my ears, almost rivaling the da-dum, doomer sound of my heartbeat, as I realized that the children before me had all been beheaded. And as I locked eyes with the teacher in the front of the room, I saw, and again could not in any other way sense, the movement of her arms as she brought them from behind her back, and slowly presented a hatchet that she carefully lifted, palms up, and placed on the desk. And finally, I heard a sound that wasn't my own heart, the heavy metal clunk of the hatchet head coming to rest on the desk. It broke the spell. Stumbling over my own feet, unable to tear my eyes away while my body fought to turn, I stumbled and bumbled and near fell as I raced out of that room, out of that building. I finally did trip and fall as I came down the 2 or 3 stairs outside, skinning my knee without feeling it, and flipping over to scoot backwards on my butt, using my legs to kick myself farther and farther away from that hellish scene. I was staring at the door as it slowly clicked shut behind me, waiting, expecting, knowing that it would fly open again, and that schoolmistress from hell would come sailing through, twitching in the light. Only this time she wouldn't be presenting the hatchet, she'd be holding it above her head to strike, surely as she had to strike the heads from her students. And then I felt a hand clap on my shoulder. I wheeled around, throwing my hands up against my face, and was greeted with voices. Familiar voices. Kate and Sarah and Rue, all clamoring. Any trace of a giggle from their voices gone now. They all looked scared, but as they took in my face and saw the blood gouting from my knee, I felt my terror infect them. Without a word, they helped me up, and despite my lungs still hammering, we all ran away from that place. We didn't stop until we were well away, blocks and blocks away, back towards the church. And then, the pain in my knee, the pain in my lungs finally made me stop, so I could cough my brains out on the side of the road. Sarah, Kate, and Rue were all talking over each other, but what came down to it was this. When I'd run off, Kate and Sarah had played it off as some teen dramatics, which it surely was, but Rue was the only one that hadn't grown up in our town. Instead, she'd grown up in a smaller town, technically a village, one by the name of Portal. And so she, more than any of us, was innately familiar with the history of that building. The Portal School, most often paired in memory and in rumor with the Heartbeat Bridge. The story went that the Portal School served the farmer kids of the loose community around Portal, Nebraska. At least it did, until a teacher one day decided she didn't want to teach anymore. She took a hatchet to the school children, not only severing their heads and leaving them in their desks, but discarding their hearts under the nearby bridge. It was said that standing on that bridge, one could hear those lost heartbeats hammering, much the way mine had. One might assume that the school would be closed after such an incident, but Nebraska, fully an agricultural state in the late 1800s stretching into the 1900s, remained open. In fact, the school had been in operation up until as recently as the early 90s, when it was finally shut down, the last one-room schoolhouse in the state, and purchased for the sum of $1, moved by the Historical Society to our town, Papillion, Nebraska. But in spite of this dry, factual accounting, residents of Portal all grew up knowing the story. Only they didn't call it the Portal School. And I suppose we shouldn't call it that either, now that we know. For those in the know about its rumored history, the school is known as the Hatchet House.
Come to think of it, My elementary school was haunted by something too. Lead paint. I suppose that doesn't make for as interesting of a story. If you liked the video, please be sure to give it a like. Commenting always appreciated, and subscription if you have the time. But I am just so delighted you were here today. Stay strange. Stay safe. Until next time, take care, strangers.